The chime of the cabin speaker in first class had barely faded when the voice of a flight attendant cut through the air, sweet but dripping with condescension. "Sir, there seems to be a mistake. You'll need to give up this seat for our VIP guest." For a split second, the cabin fell silent. Every eye turned toward a tall black man in seat 2A. David Carter, 43, had just slipped his elegant leather briefcase under the seat and had not even opened his laptop. In front of him, flight attendant Laura Bennett stood ramrod straight, her smile thin as a blade wrapped in silk. Behind her, Victoria Hensley, draped in ivory silk and diamonds glittering on her wrist, tapped her stiletto heel against the carpet, counting down her patience. "That's my seat," Victoria declared, her words sharp enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I always sit here. It's practically mine." David lifted his gaze, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. He had booked this ticket weeks in advance, paid full price, and chosen this exact seat for the legroom on a long flight. He was a platinum member, entitled to the same priority as anyone else. Yet here he was, treated as if his very presence were a clerical error. Calmly, he pulled out his wallet and presented the gleaming platinum card. His voice was steady, low, but firm. "I'm a platinum member. This seat was assigned to me." For the briefest moment, Laura's eyes betrayed surprise, then hardened again. Her smile stretched tight, rigid. "Yes, but this seat is usually reserved for more special passengers," she said, tilting her head subtly toward Victoria. The air thickened in the cabin, heavy in every chest. A murmur rippled through the rows. Phones were quietly lifted. Lenses captured every glance, every counterfeit smile. David felt it rise in his chest, the familiar burn, equal parts fury and fatigue. The sting of being diminished, pushed outside the circle of the deserving. He had lived with this since the streets of South Chicago, through boardrooms drenched in chandeliers. But this time was different. He was not just a passenger mistakenly seated. He was the man who held the fate of this airline in his hands, a truth no one in that cabin could fathom. From a row behind, a young businessman whispered to his colleague, "Maybe he bought the wrong ticket. Doesn't look like platinum." The words were like a knife, but also a naked reflection of the bias David had vowed to his father he would never bow to. Laura leaned closer, her tone lowered as though offering a favor. "Sir, why don't you move to a more comfortable seat?" More comfortable? David heard the real message. "This place isn't for you." He looked at her, gaze unwavering, his voice measured, absent of anger, but anchored in resolve. "No, I chose this seat because I need the space to work, and this is the seat I was assigned." The silence tightened like a drawn wire. Victoria's chin lifted, lips pressed into a smug curve. Around them, more phones rose into view. What began as a minor dispute over a seat was transforming into a stage. David sat tall, one hand resting on the fold-out table. In his mind flashed late nights, hammering at a keyboard until dawn. His father's fading eyes, the promise to ensure every person would be seen as human first. And now, mid-air, that promise demanded to be kept. Laura turned to walk away, but her eyes never left him. In that instant, David caught the flick of Victoria's hand as she slipped an envelope of neatly folded cash into Laura's uniform pocket. The movement was discreet but practiced, like something rehearsed 100 times. A dirty transaction, carried out in plain view under the polished lights of first class. In that moment, the mask fell. This was no mistaken seat. This was bribery. This was naked discrimination. David drew in a deep breath, steadying the rhythm of his heart. He did not shout. He did not argue. He only knew one thing. The game had just begun. And only he understood that what he carried was more than a first-class ticket. He held the key to the future of the airline itself. David Carter sat frozen in seat 2A, but his mind drifted back through the years. As the first-class cabin hushed, broken only by the low murmur of a few passengers, he could almost hear the echoes of a bleak afternoon in South Chicago, the place where his childhood had been forged in hardship. He was just 11 then, huddled in a cramped apartment with a second-hand computer salvaged from a dusty electronics shop. While other children chased a ball down the street, young David chased lines of code, eyes gleaming as the game he built came to life on the flickering screen. Every time the word success flashed, his heart pounded as if he had just scored the winning goal. But that fragile joy was never whole. At 16, one night changed everything. His father, the pillar of their family, was attacked on the same street he walked home from work each evening. The funeral was bitter and cold, incense smoke stinging the eyes. David stood before the grave, trembling hands clutching a fistful of earth. And there, the boy made a vow no one else heard, but one he would carry forever. I will make the world see one another as human first, not by the color of their skin, not by their status. That vow burned quietly within him for the next 2 decades. David grew up grinding through endless work, days spent waiting tables, nights delivering packages, and evenings hunched over a keyboard until his eyes ached. The dingy apartment on the edge of town was both his bed and his startup office. Out of that struggle rose Carter Tech, born from weary fingers coding until dawn. Those lean years forged not only a company, but a will of iron. No matter how often he was dismissed, he would answer with results. And results came. From those shaky lines of code, David built Carter Tech Solutions, now worth $2.8 billion, pioneering technology that stripped bias from customer service. The irony was cruel. The man who built tools to eliminate prejudice was now its victim, humiliated in first class. Before boarding, David had carried himself with his usual quiet grace. He lifted a suitcase for an elderly woman limping toward her gate, held the door open for a janitor balancing a trash bin, and thanked the cafe clerk with a warm smile and a simple, "Thank you. I hope you have a good day." He did it not for cameras, not for praise, but because that was who he was. Humble, kind, always seeing the person before the role. And yet here, in the polished cabin, under the eyes of strangers, he was cast as an intruder. Victoria Hensley shrugged, lips curled in a half smile as though this were routine. "This seat, of course, is mine." And Laura, the attendant paid to protect the rights of passengers, bowed her head instead to a folded stack of bills, betraying her duty in an instant. David drew a deep breath, feeling the soft leather press against his back, though his memories made it feel like sitting on the blade of a knife. Rage surged, but he would not allow himself to erupt. The calmer he was, the more dangerous he became. The quieter he stayed, the more control he held. Because no one in this cabin knew that he was far more than just a passenger. He was the man Skylux Airlines was desperately courting to secure a $50 million contract to salvage their battered reputation. And more than that, he held 25% of the company's stock, enough to shake the entire empire with a single nod. To others, he was just a man being asked to move seats. But in truth, he held the fate of thousands of airline employees in his hands. David closed his eyes for a moment, and his father's grave side vow returned. I will make the world see one another as human. When he opened them, he knew. This was the trial destiny had laid before him. In the first-class cabin, the soft glow of golden lights fell across polished leather seats. What was once an atmosphere of quiet luxury had thickened into something heavy, as if an invisible hand was tightening around everyone's throat. All eyes were fixed on seat 2A. Laura Bennett turned back toward the front of the cabin, forcing her professional smile to remain in place. But her hands trembled slightly as they brushed the edge of her uniform skirt. At that moment, Victoria Hensley stepped forward. With a movement that looked harmless, adjusting her handbag in the overhead compartment, Victoria quietly slipped a folded stack of bills into Laura's jacket pocket. The faint rustle of paper was soft, but loud enough for a few passengers nearby to hear. At the same time, she whispered, "Thank you for your help. We both know this seat belongs to me." Her words were as light as air, yet they cut into the dignity of the airline like a blade. Laura swallowed hard, her cheeks burning red. She knew the passengers' phone cameras were recording, but the weight of that money pressed harder than the unpaid bills waiting at home, harder than the looming mortgage. David Carter saw everything. He didn't speak. He only furrowed his brow, his eyes turning cold as glass, cutting through the thin veil of civility to the rot beneath. He had seen transactions like this countless times in his life, hands reaching for money to buy justice. But never had the charade been performed so brazenly, right before his eyes. From the back of the cabin came firm footsteps. Trevor Collins, the cabin supervisor, appeared. His navy uniform was crisp, his tie perfectly knotted, his stride heavy with the air of a man who fancied himself judge of the skies. Trevor prided himself on his authority, the power to decide who was worthy to sit where and who should be made to bow. He stopped right beside David, his voice raised for all to hear. "Sir, we need you to move to another seat and allow our VIP guest to be accommodated." David looked up, eyes still fixed on the tablet screen he had just closed. His voice was even, not loud, yet it carried through the cabin like the low notes of a solemn song. "I have already shown my platinum card. This is the seat printed on my ticket. I am not moving." A hush fell over the cabin. Trevor narrowed his eyes, the corners of his mouth twitching into a faint, humorless smile. He leaned in slightly, dropping his tone to a near whisper, but just loud enough for nearby Rose to hear. "There are two ways this can go. Easy or hard. Your choice." The threat slid into the air like an icy draft. Passengers shifted uneasily. A man murmured to his wife, "He should just give it up. Not worth the trouble." But across the aisle, a businesswoman quietly lifted her phone, recording every second. David set his stylus down on the tray table, then raised his head. His eyes were calm, yet glowing like steel pulled from the fire. "I have already chosen. I will stay. This is my seat." 6 short words, but they struck the cabin like a gavel slamming down in court. Trevor froze, his face flushing red. For the first time in his shift, he felt control slipping through his grip. His polished shoes shifted awkwardly on the carpet before he spun around sharply. Heavy footsteps carried him to the service phone at the front of the cabin, his voice urgent, his hands gesturing sharply. Everyone understood. He was calling for backup. Meanwhile, Victoria still blocked the aisle, lips curled into a triumphant smile. She tapped her diamond watch as if conducting an orchestra, certain the ending was already decided. The man would be dragged from his seat, and she would reclaim her throne. But there was one thing Victoria could never imagine. The man she was so determined to push aside was not just an inconvenient passenger. He was the largest shareholder of Skylux Airlines, the very one who could push the company off the cliff with a single decision. David closed his eyes briefly, his hands interlacing calmly as though he were in a boardroom, not in the middle of a storm. Around him, the whispers, the hurried breaths, the tapping of keyboards from the back row, all blended into a familiar symphony. The sound of prejudice, of pressure, of trial. But this time, the stage no longer belonged to Trevor, nor to Victoria. It was slowly, inevitably, becoming the stage of David Carter. The first-class cabin hung heavy in tense silence. Every eye was fixed on the front, where Trevor Collins was speaking hastily into the service phone, his sharp hand gestures betraying his frustration, as though he could bend the situation to his will through sheer authority. Then, click. The cockpit door opened. Captain Alan Reeves stepped out. Tall, broad, shouldered, his face etched with lines from 30 years of flying, Alan carried himself with the weight of command. His uniform was immaculate, his cap tucked under his arm, his gaze cutting swiftly through the cabin. The chatter ceased instantly. For passengers, a captain was never just a pilot. He was the symbol of absolute authority in the sky. Alan walked straight to seat 2A, with Trevor and Laura following behind. Standing over David Carter, his voice was deep and resonant, like the low rumble of engines outside the window. "I understand there has been an issue. For the convenience of all passengers, I am requesting that you change your seat. The crew has the authority to reassign seating for overall comfort." The words were coated in courtesy, but their meaning was clear. It was not a request, it was an order. David lifted his head, meeting Alan's commanding stare without a flicker of hesitation. His voice was calm, measured. "Captain, with all due respect, I have a ticket for seat 2A. I am a platinum member. I chose this seat because I need the leg room to work. There is no policy that requires me to surrender my seat simply because someone else prefers it." His words struck the air like a declaration. A few passengers nodded subtly. Others raised their phones higher to capture every moment. To them, this was no longer a dispute over a seat. It was the image of a man standing firm for his rightful place, and the outlines of discrimination were coming into focus. Trevor snapped, unable to hold back. He leaned in, his voice low, hissing through clenched teeth. "If you insist on being difficult, we will be forced to remove you from the aircraft." The threat hit the cabin like a hammer. For a moment, the entire cabin held its breath. David arched an eyebrow, revealing for the first time a flash of surprise. He enunciated each word. "You are threatening to take me off this flight because I am sitting in the seat assigned to me?" The question sliced through the air. Whispers rippled among the passengers. An older businessman nearby shook his head, his lips moving. "Unbelievable." A young woman snapped photos rapidly, a tear sliding down her cheek. Victoria Hensley, still blocking the aisle, suddenly raised her sharp voice. "This is ridiculous. I have an important meeting as soon as we land. I always sit there. How can you let someone like him take that seat?" The cabin froze. Her words ripped away the thin disguise. This was no longer about rules or procedure. This was blatant favoritism. Alan Reeves inhaled sharply, then leaned closer to David, his tone chilling. "This is your final warning. Either you move, or we will call security." That was the breaking point. David slowly reached into his jacket pocket, every movement deliberate. He pulled out his phone and opened the camera. His voice was steady, but it carried with force. "Let me be clear about what is happening. I am being threatened with removal from this flight for refusing to give up the seat assigned to me so it can be handed to another passenger." The lens captured Trevor's flushed face, Alan's hard glare, and Victoria's smug smirk. A few passengers called out, "He's right," and "Record everything." Trevor lost his composure, lunging to grab the phone. "Recording is not allowed," he barked. David pulled his hand back smoothly, his tone even. "There is no federal law prohibiting passengers from recording on board, unless it interferes with the crew's duties. I am simply protecting myself." His confidence stopped Trevor cold. The supervisor's fists clenched, but no argument came. The atmosphere surged with heat. Every heartbeat seemed to pound in unison. Everyone understood. If David gave in, justice itself would collapse. But David had no intention of yielding. In the thick of that standoff, he whispered inwardly, "Father, I promised, and I will keep my word." Outside the cabin door, footsteps thundered closer. 2 security officers were approaching. The entire flight was about to witness a confrontation unlike anything they had ever seen. The thud of boots echoed against the carpet, heavy and cold, like war drums announcing calamity. Every head in first class turned. 2 airport security officers in black uniforms strode quickly down the aisle, their faces expressionless, their eyes sharp as blades. The air froze. The whispers died. Only the steady hum of the engines outside and the pounding hearts of the passengers remained. Trevor Collins exhaled in relief, chest puffing out as if reinforcements had arrived at his command. Laura Bennett lowered her head, avoiding everyone's eyes, but her hand clenched over the pocket where Victoria's money had just been slipped. As for Victoria Hensley, she smiled a sly half-smile, poised like a queen about to reclaim her throne. The 2 officers stopped in front of seat 2A. One of them spoke in a flat tone. "Sir, we've received a report regarding this incident. We need you to gather your belongings and leave the aircraft immediately." David Carter looked up, his eyes ablaze, though his voice was calm, as still as a mirror, smooth lake. "I want clarity. What policy of the airline am I violating?" The question pierced the air like an arrow. For a fleeting second, uncertainty flashed across the officer's face. The other shifted his gaze, evasive. "We are just following orders. Please cooperate." David did not shout. He sat upright, placing his phone on his lap, the camera still recording. Passengers around him held their breath. Some snapped photos, others began to film. The cabin had become a courtroom, every phone a witness. He locked eyes with Captain Alan Reeves, standing just a few steps away. His voice rang out, each word distinct, booming like a verdict. "Am I being asked to leave this flight simply because I refuse to surrender my rightful seat to another passenger?" Alan faltered, beads of sweat forming on his brow. Trevor rushed in, his tone sharp and clipped. "You are being removed for causing a disturbance and refusing to cooperate. Don't make this worse." The cabin erupted in murmurs. An older man shook his head. "This is absurd. He's just sitting in his seat." A young woman wiped away tears, whispering, "Why would they treat him this way?" The support grew, small sparks spreading like wildfire. David knew this moment would be etched into memory. He carefully folded his tablet, slipped it into his case, and stood. Taller than Trevor, his back straight, his gaze fixed forward. He carried not the posture of a man humiliated, but of a commander retreating with dignity, preparing to strike back. A soft voice rose from the back. "He didn't do anything wrong. I recorded everything." A female passenger held her phone high, her hands trembling but her eyes resolute. Victoria arched an eyebrow, whistling faintly as though it were all theatre. She smirked wider as David was escorted, then leaned in just enough for nearby cameras to capture her words. "In first class, there are standards. You don't belong here." And to seal the scene, she slipped another wad of cash into Trevor's pocket, whispering, "Thank you for handling this." Eyes widened around them. Several passengers gripped their phones tighter. They knew the moment had been captured, money exchanged for humiliation. David walked down the aisle, flanked by security, but his stride never faltered. His head remained high, his gaze steady, as though he was not being forced out in defeat, but stepping back to prepare his next move. He knew, and only he knew, that the airline had just made a fatal mistake, humiliating its largest shareholder in front of dozens of witnesses and millions of viewers who would soon see the video. In his mind, his father's graveside vow resounded, "I will make the world see each other as human beings." And now, he smiled faintly, because he understood. The real battle had only just begun. The airplane door slammed shut behind him, leaving first class buzzing with chaotic whispers. David Carter strode down the jet bridge, flanked by 2 security officers. His shadow stretched long across the cold plastic floor, not the shadow of a defeated man, but of someone well accustomed to long battles. In that brief moment, his heart still pounded. Not from fear, but from anger kept tightly restrained. He had just been humiliated in front of dozens of people, removed from his rightful seat for no reason other than the color of his skin and the corrupt habit of a socialite who believed herself entitled. Yet deep inside, David felt a familiar foreburning. The same foe that once drove a boy in South Chicago to kneel at his father's grave and vow, "I will never let anyone be diminished simply for who they are." As he stepped into the terminal, one of the security officers hesitated. Reading back the report on his tablet, the man frowned. "Sir, the report says you caused a disturbance, but witness statements, they don't match." His voice trailed off, eyes shifting away. Then, as if eager to avoid further trouble, he turned and left with his partner, abandoning David in the midst of the murmuring passengers. David drew in a steady breath, regaining his composure. He pulled out his phone, fingers flying across the screen. "Sarah, I was removed from the flight. Call the legal team immediately. Prepare an emergency meeting." It was a message to his COO, the woman who had stood at his side for over 15 years. Seconds later, his phone rang. "David, what happened?" Sarah Thompson's voice was sharp with urgency. "Blatant discrimination," he replied firmly. "I have proof. They just humiliated the wrong man." Before he could pocket the phone, a tentative female voice came from behind. "Excuse me, sir." David turned. A young woman, late 20s, clutched her handbag tightly to her chest. Her eyes were red, brimming with both outrage and resolve. She had been seated diagonally across from him, and he remembered catching sight of her phone raised when it all began. I recorded everything," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "From the moment the flight attendant asked you to move to when that woman handed over money. It's all clear." She held out her glowing screen. The video played smoothly. Laura slipping the cash into her pocket, Trevor leaning in with threats, Captain Reeves hiding behind vague excuses, and finally, Victoria stuffing another wad of bills into Trevor's hand as David was escorted away. Every sordid detail, undeniable. A shiver ran through David, but this time it wasn't anger, it was power. This was the ace in his hand. He looked at the young woman with deep gratitude. "Thank you. You've just given me something that will change the entire game." She nodded, eyes blazing. "If needed, I'll testify. Everyone in that cabin saw it. This can't be buried." David smiled, the first genuine smile since the ordeal began. They exchanged contact information, and the video was transferred to his phone, instantly backed up to a secure cloud. He knew within hours this footage would sweep across social media, and Skylux Airlines would be staring into the eye of a storm. Seated in the VIP lounge, warm light cast over his resolute face, David opened his recorder and spoke steadily. "Today, on a Skylux flight, I, passenger David Carter, was forcibly removed from my assigned seat 2A. The reason? I refused to surrender it to a favored customer who bribed the staff. I was threatened, insulted, and escorted off the plane. This is my official statement." Each word fell like a hammer, striking nails into the coffin of the airline's reputation. Outside the glass, the plane he had left was preparing for takeoff. On board, Victoria was likely sipping champagne, believing she had reclaimed her throne at 2A. Trevor was surely counting bills in his pocket, while Laura bit her lip, praying the incident would fade into silence. But they did not know. Inside the lounge, David Carter was turning humiliation into a weapon. He was not merely a passenger who had been removed. He was the man holding the fate of Skylux Airlines in his hands. And once that video spread, the entire system would tremble. Leaning back into his chair, his eyes shone like steel. He knew. From this moment forward, the battle would no longer be confined to a narrow airplane cabin. It would explode across social media, in boardrooms, and on front pages. And this time, he was the one at the controls. The 32nd floor of Skylux Airlines headquarters in New York glowed under the harsh white of LED lights. Glass walls reflected the city wrapped in grey mist. Richard Williams, 58, the company's CEO, sat in his walnut-paneled office, eyes fixed on the quarterly revenue report. The numbers were not great, but enough to reassure shareholders until the red light on his desk phone began to flash. "Sir, we have a problem," the trembling voice of the communications director came through. "A video. It's spreading at an uncontrollable speed." Williams frowned. He was no stranger to crises, delays, lost luggage, even online arguments. But that tone carried something different. "What video?" he growled. A click. The giant screen on the wall lit up. The clip played in sharp detail, so clear every wrinkle on Trevor Collins' face was visible. It showed David Carter calmly presenting his boarding pass, Laura Bennett freezing as she took the cash, Trevor leaning down to threaten, Captain Reeves repeating hollow excuses. And then the final blow, Victoria Hensley slipping more money into Trevor's pocket as David was escorted off. There was no explanation that could erase what the world was now seeing. The evidence was undeniable. Williams sat frozen. 30 years of executive experience had not prepared him for this moment. His voice came out hoarse. "How many views?" "Already past 2 million, sir. The number is climbing by the minute. Our Skylux discrimination is trending at the top on Twitter, TikTok, Instagram. Major outlets are picking it up." In the adjoining boardroom, other screens displayed stock charts. The green line plunged straight down, like a stone dropped into a canyon. "Down 12%, 14, a financial officer muttered, sweat beading on his forehead. "My God," Williams buried his head in his hands. But the true blow was still coming. "We've identified the passenger," the communications chief said, swallowing hard. "His name is David Carter." The room froze. A vice president in charge of investments whispered, "That can't be." Williams snapped his head around. "Did you say Carter? As in CEO Carter Tech?" "Yes, sir. That's him." The boardroom erupted in a storm of panicked voices. They all knew the name. Carter Tech, a multi-billion-dollar tech company, leader in AI solutions to eliminate bias in customer service. Skylux had been chasing a partnership with them for 2 years. More damning still, confidential reports confirmed Carter Tech and its partners had quietly accumulated nearly 25% of Skylux's shares. Williams' face drained of color. His Mont Blanc pen slipped from his hand and clattered on the floor. He understood instantly. If David Carter chose to, with a single phone call, Skylux could collapse like a sandcastle against the tide. As executives scrambled in fear, miles away in an airport lounge, David sat in silence. His phone buzzed non-stop. Emails reporting the video had passed 5 million views, a flood of interview requests from major outlets. COO Sarah messaged, "Legal and communications teams are ready. Just give the word." David stared at the screen. the corner of his mouth lifting into a cold smile. He remembered Victoria's smug face, Trevor's dismissive sneer, Laura's forced smile. They thought they had won by throwing him off the plane. In truth, they had just lit the fuse to the biggest explosion in the airline's history. Back at headquarters, Williams roared, "Get Carter on the line! I need to speak to him, and now!" The line connected. His voice echoed through the massive boardroom. "Mr. Carter," Williams began, strained and forced. I want to offer the deepest apologies on behalf of Skylux." On the other end, David Carter's voice was calm, measured, but cutting. "I don't need apologies, Mr. Williams. I need accountability and trust. Today, Skylux has lost both." Around the boardroom table, the executives sat pale and silent. They understood. This was no longer about a seat on an airplane. This was about the survival of their entire empire. And the man holding the scales of justice was the passenger they had humiliated. The Skylux Airlines boardroom had never been this silent. Black leather chairs lined the 10-meter walnut table. On the giant screen, the stock chart bled red, plunging like an open wound no one could close. Directors whispered among themselves, faces pale, some still in golf attire, others with ties askew from rushing in. All had abandoned whatever they were doing at the sudden summons. "Emergency board meeting. Passenger David Carter." The door swung open. David Carter walked in. No bodyguards, no ceremony. Just a man in a grey suit wrinkled from a disrupted journey, carrying his familiar leather briefcase. But the heavy silence in the room made it clear. Everyone knew this was no longer just a passenger. This was the most powerful shareholder, the man who had ignited global outrage with a 15-minute video. David did not need to strike the table for silence. His presence alone cut off every whisper. He sat at the empty chair at the head of the table, back straight, eyes sweeping across the tense faces. Behind him stood Sarah Thompson, COO of Carter Tech, flanked by 2 lawyers and a communications director. The team was small, but their steely gazes promised they were ready to shred any excuse to pieces. On the screen, the video played again. Every detail sharp. Laura taking the cash, Trevor issuing threats, Captain Reeves spouting empty words, Victoria sliding another bundle of money into Trevor's pocket as David was dragged away. When the clip ended, the room was so still it seemed a pin drop would echo. Several directors lowered their heads, unable to meet David's eyes. Richard Williams, CEO of Skylux, swallowed hard, then forced out words. "Mr. Carter, I would like to extend on behalf of the entire company our deepest apologies. This is—" "Stop!" David cut him off. His voice was calm yet icy, like a blade drawn across glass. "I am not here for apologies. I am here for accountability." The room tensed. Williams pressed his lips together, sweat soaking through his shirt. David braced both hands on the table and looked directly into each board member's eyes. Today, it was not just one passenger humiliated. It was not just one first-class seat stolen. Today, you allowed your employees to turn this airline into a stage for discrimination, for bribery, for disgrace. And worst of all, you let it happen to your largest shareholder. A few nervous coughs rippled through the room, but David pressed on before anyone could interrupt. My demands are only two. First, every individual involved, from flight attendant Laura Bennett, supervisor Trevor Collins, to Captain Alan Reeves, must be terminated immediately. No suspension, no token discipline. Fired. Second, the $50 million partnership agreement between Carter Tech and Skylux that you have been counting on, I am cancelling it. Chaos spread across the room. Some directors exclaimed, "Impossible," while others exchanged frantic glances. Williams hurried to intervene. "Mr. Carter, please reconsider. These employees, many have served for decades. If we suspend them, conduct a thorough review." "No," David interrupted firmly. "This is not about years of service. This is about integrity. If they can take bribes and humiliate a customer openly on camera, they have no place in aviation." His voice dropped lower, but each word landed like a hammer. "Either you fire them, or I pull out every share and every deal. Then watch how long your stock survives." A financial director went pale, his pen slipping from his fingers. "If Carter sells off, the stock could fall another 30% this week." Another whispered, "Funds will follow. We'll collapse." As if to seal the point, the doors burst open. A young analyst rushed in, clutching a tablet. "Bad news. The stock is already down 18% and projected to hit 30% by market close unless we act decisively." The board fell into hell. Faces drained of color. All understood. The airline's future now rested in the hands of the man they had thrown out of seat 2A. David leaned back in his chair, his gaze still sharp as steel. He did not pound the table. He did not shout. His silence alone was enough to make the room tremble. In that moment, every person present grasped the bitter truth. The man they had humiliated on their aircraft was the one who now held the power to decide whether Skylux Airlines was lived or died. The wall clock struck exactly 4:30 p.m. when the HR office door opened. Inside the cold, sterile room, a long conference table held only 3 folders, stacked neatly like verdicts awaiting delivery. In the chairs sat Laura Bennett, Trevor Collins, and Captain Alan Reeves, frozen stiff, their eyes avoiding one another. The air was suffocating. 2 security officers in black suits stood silently near the door, their presence requiring no explanation. The HR director, a middle-aged woman with a face carved from stone, pulled out her chair, placed her laptop on the table, and spoke in a voice as steady as a typewriter's keys. "I will be direct. Your employment contracts are terminated effective immediately. This is the final decision of the board, based on evidence that cannot be disputed." Laura broke into sobs, her shoulders trembling. "Please, give me another chance. I only—" "You accepted money from a passenger to commit discrimination." The director cut her off coldly. "The cameras and dozens of witnesses confirmed it. This was not a momentary mistake. This was bribery." Trevor slammed his hand on the table, face burning red. "That was just handling the situation. He was stubborn, causing trouble." The laptop screen spun towards them. The video played in full, unedited. Trevor leaning in to threaten David, Laura slipping the cash into her pocket, Reeves mumbling weak excuses, and finally Victoria stuffing another bundle into Trevor's jacket as David was escorted away. The audio rang out clearly. "First class has standards. Colour drained from Trevor's face. He stammered, "No, it's not what it looks like." "Then tell me, what exactly are those standards?" the director asked, her eyes piercing through him. No one answered. Alan Reeves, the veteran captain of 30 years, lowered his head. A heavy sigh escaped his chest. "I was wrong to trust my crew's judgment. I should have stopped it. But I did not." His eyes turned bloodshot. For the first time, the collapse of a man who once believed cockpit authority could shield every decision was plain to see. The director closed her laptop, her voice unchanged. "You will each receive 2 weeks of severance pay. After that, Skylux severs all ties. This decision takes effect immediately. Security will escort you out and collect your badges." Laura wept uncontrollably. Trevor cursed, only to be pinned down by the firm hand of a guard. Reeves said nothing, only removed his captain's hat and placed it on the table, his trembling fingers smoothing the brim one last time after thousands of flights. As they were led out, the long hallway became a reversed honor guard. No applause, only cold stares following them. A few young employees whispered, their phones buzzing with the latest headline: "Skylux Airlines fires all staff tied to discrimination scandal." Upstairs, the board sat in grim silence. An elderly director rasped, "This is no longer about 3 employees. This is a sickness in the company's culture." David Carter leaned back in his chair, fingers interlocked. His eyes locked on Richard Williams, CEO of Skylux, as he spoke slowly. "Today you fired 3 people. But if you do not fix the root, tomorrow there will be 3 more, and then 3 after that. I will not invest millions in a system that is rotten." Williams pressed his lips tight, sweat tracing down his temple. He understood. David was not just demanding scapegoats. He was demanding reform. Outside the headquarters, reporters and cameras swarmed. The stock ticker flashed bright. Skylux down 21%. On national television, footage of David being escorted off the plane played side by side with images of Laura, Trevor, and Reeves leaving the building in disgrace. No medals, no farewell. Only humiliation clinging to them like a shadow. David looked out through the tower's glass, the sunset casting a golden hue over the city. In his eyes there was no satisfaction, only a cold resolve. This was merely the beginning. The next day, every employee of Skylux Airlines was summoned to the Grand Hall at headquarters. More than 400 faces filled the seats, from rookie flight attendants to veteran regional managers. The air was thick, heavy, like the stillness before a storm. On stage, the glowing words read, "Emergency all. Company meeting." Richard Williams, the CEO, stood in the spotlight, his face hollow from sleepless nights. Beside him was not a deputy, not the chairman of the board, but David Carter, the very man who just a day earlier had been dragged out of seat 2A like an unwelcome stranger. Williams's voice was rough, strained. "Yesterday, Skylux Airlines failed. We failed to protect a passenger. We failed to uphold the dignity this industry is supposed to represent." He paused, took a deep breath, then pointed toward David. "That passenger is our largest shareholder, and today he has something to say." A wave of murmurs rippled across the hall. Hundreds of eyes locked on David as he stepped forward with steady strides, gripping the microphone firmly. He needed no notes, no slides. I was removed from a flight, not because my ticket was wrong, but because my appearance did not match seat 2A. The words fell like a hammer blow. Some employees dropped their gaze. Others blinked rapidly, unwilling to meet his eyes. David's voice grew stronger. But I am not here to demand justice for myself. I am here to speak for the thousands of nameless passengers who are dismissed, ignored, and humiliated every single day, without the chance to be heard. I had the power to fight back. They do not. The hall grew heavy with silence. In the front rows, a few attendants nodded solemnly, some wiping away tears. David paused, then spoke slowly, with weight. That is why, starting today, Skylux will change, not with slogans, not with hollow apologies, with action. He turned to Williams, who gave a reluctant nod, like a man carrying out a sentence already passed. I declare, Skylux Airlines will ground all flights for the next 48 hours. Every route, every service, every plane will stop. Every employee, from pilots and attendants to executives, will undergo bias training and professional integrity workshops led by Carter Tech. The hall erupted in a roar of disbelief. 48 hours of shutdown. In aviation, a single cancelled flight costs hundreds of thousands. 2 full days of stoppage? A financial disaster. A senior manager rose from the back, shouting, "Are you trying to kill this company?" David met his eyes with a cold, steady stare. No, I am trying to save it. Because if Skylux does not change now, justice and the passengers themselves will destroy it. The response froze the hall. Williams spoke again, his voice trembling yet firm. We will lose tens of millions, but that is the price. If not, Skylux will lose everything. In the rows of seats, young employees whispered, "The airline has never dared do this before." A flight attendant covered her face, sobbing, "This should have happened long ago." David stepped down from the stage, his gaze sweeping over every face. He saw no triumph, only resolve. This is not punishment. This is opportunity. An opportunity for Skylux to truly earn the trust passengers give us. You are not only responsible for their safety in the air, you are guardians of their dignity. In that moment, the hall fell into profound silence. Hundreds of hearts beat together, realizing they were witnessing not just a business decision, but a cultural revolution. And it had begun with a man once dragged from seat 2A, now standing as a torchbearer, lighting the path for an entire airline. In the world of aviation, where every minute of delay is measured in money, a 48-hour grounding may appear to be a fatal wound. But sometimes, to save a body already rotting from within, one must cut it open, expose the wound, and begin to heal. The story of David Carter is not just about a seat labeled 2A. It is about the cold stares, the silent prejudices, the dirty money once exchanged for another person's humiliation. Yet from that very seat came a powerful message. Justice can be delayed, but it can never be buried. David did not gloat when 3 employees were escorted out of the building. He did not revel in forcing the airline to shut down for 48 hours. Because in his heart, this was never about personal revenge. It was a reminder that every industry, every company, must ultimately face one truth. Human dignity is the most precious asset. On social media, the video continued to spread, but alongside it came thousands of comments filled with hope. That Skylux could start again. That if one person dares to stand up, millions of others will find courage, too. And inside the training rooms during those 48 decisive hours, it was not just attendants, pilots, or supervisors relearning how to serve passengers. They were relearning how to see their fellow human beings. David once promised at his father's grave, "I will make people see one another as human beings first." Today, that promise echoed across the skies. If you believe that justice does not come from belated apologies, but from real change, hit like and subscribe to continue this journey with us, and leave a short comment. Justice wins, so this reminder can travel further, beyond borders, beyond color, until everywhere human beings are respected for who they truly are.